It's like being underwater. Sound is distorted and washy. To start with, there's just noise, and my brain is too scrambled to make sense of it. I become aware that the entire surface of my skin is slick with sweat and hot, like when you wake up under a heavy duvet on a summer night. My head is pounding in time with my pulse, which is also thudding in my ears. The noises are starting to unscramble. I'm detecting a rhythm at odds with my heartbeat, and the shrieking resolves itself slowly into the sound of a guitar and a voice. My hips, arse, and legs send me a signal. I'm sitting down on a hard surface, and the message from my upper back suggests it too is propped against something flat and solid. Feeling seems to be flowing back to me from the edges, and I become aware of my own heavy, ragged breathing just as the noise starts to coalesce into a song I know that I know. It's still too fucking loud, or my brain is still too fried to make it out, though. As I take that moment to try and slow my breathing by taking slow, deep breath. Fuck me, that hurts. As soon as I become aware again of my stomach, the breath flies out at me in a gasp. A million miles away, I feel tears force their way into my squeezed shut eyes, and I feel, but cannot hear, a whimper like a dog whine past my throat. I feel like there is some monstrous iron strap across my lower chest, one that has been ratcheted so tight that it has crushed the bottom of my rib cage. The pain is utterly unyielding and ferocious, and I don't want to breathe in deeply. I don't want to breathe. The memory of the pain of the last inhalation is burning in my brain, and I don't want to breathe. I'm not sure I can. Seconds tick by at a rate of 1 every 1,000 years, and I can't breathe. I don't want to breathe. It's the craziest thing. The habit is so utterly natural and ingrained that I keep finding myself about to anyway. It's exactly like when you try not to cough when you have a tickly throat, only with blinding pain. I want to breathe. I need to breathe. I can't breathe. I don't want to breathe. Round and round, seconds drip, drip, drip. My lungs start to ache, and my head, only just clearing, begins to fade again. At that point, as I feel the edges of consciousness become slippery again, the involuntary impulse steps in. Breathe, fucker. And I inhale too sharply and too deeply, and a bolt of savage pain stabs my guts. Motherfucker, that hurts. It hurts. Tears in my eyes, a coppery taste in the back of my throat. Oh, please, please me, don't cough. But I'm more awake again, not that I particularly want to be. And it occurs to me that the pain is predominantly in the bottom of my lungs. Experimentally, I draw a very slow, shallow breath from the top, trying to will my ribs not to move, my diaphragm not to engage. It still hurts. There's a warning, a groaning, creaking, cracking feeling. But it's bearable, and I'm drawing air again in small, shallow breaths. I feel like I'm a tiny rodent exposed in sudden moonlight, or one of those fucking rabbits in Watership Down going Tharn in the middle of the fucking road with a truck coming full bore. But I'm sucking air. I'm still alive. I concentrate on this feeling, and as my screwed shut eyes slowly relax into being merely closed, the ear-splitting noise resolves itself. It's Wolfmother, Joker and the Thief at a truly sickening volume. The instrumental has ended, and we're back into the riff verse. I have time to wonder if I've somehow jammed up the volume on my MP3 player, but it's clearly external in source. My player doesn't go that loud, and I can feel the bass rumble through my mercifully undamaged legs. Okay, situation report. I can breathe just. My stomach is fucking killing me, and fuck knows what internal bleeding feels like, but this is a busted rib. Has to be. That's why breathing hurts. What kind of designer creates a protector for your internal organs that can fuck them up so badly when broken? Intelligent design my entire arse. Okay, so I'm left shallow breathing like a 15-year-old virgin at his first confession. Lovely. What else? I'm sitting on the floor leaning against a wall. My upper back is pretty straight and my head is resting upright. My neck feels okay, but fuck if I'm moving a millimetre to test anything. The memory of my head smacking off concrete, and thank fuck for my helmet, and the following jolt, yeah, let's not push it. Okay, what else? Arms. Oh, fuck yeah. There's a horrible sick throbbing just above both elbows. The pain there is a snarling, slavering, cancerous, rabid junkyard pit bull, growling low and long and deep. Go ahead and try to move, fucker, and I'll eat your fucking bollocks. I am profoundly disinclined to disbelieve it. Nevertheless, I allow my brain to send exploratory signals, passive, down my arms. The report back doesn't fill me with joy. Below the fault lines in my upper arms, giving off the certainty of agony at any muscular twinge, things seem undamaged. But the feeling is slippery, untrustworthy, in part because of the distraction of the pain above, but also because my hands are still, I think, gloved, and also, unless I'm completely off base, bound together. It's hard to be certain. You try to hold your hands behind your back, with gloves on, and then fracture both arms and see if you could be sure. But there are times when the gut knows. And fuck my luck, man, because I'm sure. Whoever was dragging me when I passed out has put me on the floor and tied my hands behind my back and leaned me up against the wall. I have time, so fleetingly, to be grateful that I wasn't conscious for that particular horror show of agony, but the moment passes almost before it arrives because, well, fuck. There was a baseball bat, and my arms and ribs are broken, and I'm tied up, and someone has done all this to me and is now trying to deafen me with Wolfmother. Which is pretty funny, because so was I, basically, if you take the long view, but still. While my mind has taken this little journey, my still too shallow breathing has begun to slow, which is nice. Did I read somewhere once that you only need 15% of your lung capacity to keep functioning? For sure, people live with only one lung, so having two firing, even at 1/4 capacity, should be enough to keep me going, surely, as long as things don't get too strenuous. That's a thought I shy away from very quickly. A word you don't want to consider too deeply with your broken arms tied behind your back is strain. Point is, the pain has levelled out. It lies there in my arms and gut, coiled, ready to strike at the slightest provocation, and still throbbing sickly with every beat of my heart. But it is somehow miraculously manageable in the moment to moment. And as Joker and the Thief gives way to Colossal, I decide it's time to grow a pair and open my eyes. I let my eyelids peel apart slowly, lashes stuck together loosely with sweat, and blink a few times. The room swims into focus. Bare floorboards stretch to a plain wall rising in front of me. There's space for a window, but it has been bricked up from the inside. Recently, to judge by the clean red of the bricks and the faint smell of cement. There's a single light source in the ceiling, artificial and bright, but fuck if I'm checking that shit out right now. The deafening noise, ha-ha, is coming from either side, and again, I'm not engaging my neck to get any more detail than that. Besides, there's someone in the room with me, leaning against the fresh brickwork in the non-window. He's a little taller than me, his dark hair shaved so close he's practically a skinhead. Eyes dark brown, almost black, hooked boxer's nose, thin mouth, vague baby's bum chin, clean-shaven. Sleeveless plain white vest shows off some muscle, more than is strictly necessary. Baggy combat trousers, camo pattern, white Adidas trainers. Nothing, not a single thing about his appearance recommends itself to me. I'm surprised my body chemistry has room within it to feel anything other than pain, but somehow it does. The skin on my balls contracts and my mouth dries up. I am in deep shit here. My eyes travel back up to that face, those eyes, to try and take the measure. There's intelligence and curiosity in that face, and it strikes me even capacity for humour. But I see no compassion, no empathy, and, I think, no conscience. He raises an arm and I make out a remote control device of some kind. He points it at me, or close to me, and I am too stupid even to flinch until after the moment has passed, and in the meantime Wolfmother suddenly dies down to, well, not a whisper, but somewhere just below background din. A smile flicks briefly across his face. "Hello," he says. To be exact, what he says is, "Hello." The voice that says it is smooth, just a touch higher than you might expect from such a masculine frame. It's a London accent. North, east, fuck knows. The common one, whatever that is. "So," he licks his lips nervously, tries another, longer smile. This one reaches his eyes, but manages to be 0% reassuring. Fuck. "Here we are. Sorry for the drama getting you in here. I didn't plan this too well, as you can probably tell." A single soft laugh, not quite a giggle. "Yeah, got a bit over-enthusiastic with the bat. My bad, man." Again, the smile, this time apologetic, but the eyes. Ah, the eyes, they tell a different tale, don't they? And not a comforting one. "Seemed like the quickest way to get you in, but I obviously overdone it, didn't I? Yeah. Never mind." All one word. He draws a deeper breath. "I suppose we should get this bit out of the way. I'll talk, and after, if you've got any questions." A shrugging gesture, vague wave of his left hand. Southpaw? "So, basically, scratching the back of his head, eyes to the ceiling, reflecting, looking for a rehearsed or at least learned passage. I've always wanted to torture someone to death.
A cyclist is knocked unconscious on his way home and wakes up in a nightmare. A devoted husband begins to suspect all is not well with his marriage. A desperate family man, running out of time and options, turns to an old schoolmate and the wrong side of the tracks, looking for work, any work. A young man's world is thrown into chaos as his father is abducted. 4 tales of people pushed to breaking point. Breaking Point was written by Kit Power and published by the Sinister Horror Company in 2016. In this episode of Sinister Reread, Justin Park chats with Kit about one of the publisher's more toe-curling collections. Hi, this is Justin from the Sinister Horror Company. I'm here with Kit Power, here today to discuss his book, his collection, Breaking Point. Hi Kit, how are you?
Hey man, I'm doing good. It is so good to hear you, man. It is so good to be talking to you. It's been such a crazy year, and I have missed my tribe. So it's really good to hear you. How you doing?
Yeah, I'm good. I mean, lockdown has been a bit difficult, hasn't it? Sort of for everybody, and all those conventions that we thought were going to happen, including StokerCon, that was like going to be such a big deal, and I was so excited that being in the UK, and then that kind of just not happening because that was just after lockdown, wasn't it? Really?
Yeah, that's right.
Kick in, and then all the other ones, Edge Lit, HorrorCon UK, all the ones that we used to go to catch up with people, just not been there. So no. It's been tough from that sort of thing.
Yeah, it's weird, isn't it? I mean, I keep thinking I'm all right, and it's only really when I do talk to people, like for some event or reading or online event, and then I'm suddenly like, Jesus, I miss you guys.
We're here today to talk about your book, Breaking Point, which is actually it's a collection of full stories, isn't it?
Yeah.
And the first question I always like to ask authors when I talk about their work and talk about a specific book is, why did you write the book?
Yeah. So it's a good question. I think I'll start with Lifeline, although this applies certainly to the first 3 stories in the collection, what I call the Lifeline trilogy. These are really the first pieces I wrote after I decided to take writing seriously. So I wrote very, very periodically, very occasionally throughout my life. From the age of about 10 or 11, I'd write short stories, but it was always very much a kind of I mean, this is going to sound pretentious, but it's just what it is. I'd only write if I really felt like I had to. Like, I'd get to the point where I'd have a story that would just be, I would start to feel frustrated that I hadn't written it, and then I'd write it. But unless I felt that level of impulse, I wouldn't do it. And everything I ever wrote up to that point had been written in a single session, so it rarely went over 2,000 words. So I'm really short stories. And they were okay, but I never did anything with them. I never tried to publish them. I don't think I even really shared them with many people, maybe my parents. But, it really was just for me. And then I did some distance learning a few years ago for work. I did a distance learning. Well, I did a course for the OU, actually, an Open University module for a year. And to do that, you've got to carve out like between 12 and 16 hours a week to work, right? To study. 10 to 12 maybe if you really sort of focus and cram. And I did that, and I did it for a year, and I passed the modules, and I realized 2 things. One was that I never wanted to do any more studying of that kind as long as I lived, because I just didn't. And that's no disrespect at all to the Open University. The materials were fantastic, as was the teaching. It's just I don't like formal education in that way. It doesn't work for me. It doesn't work for me as a model. I don't enjoy it. But the other thing it did make me realize was like I had I had time that I didn't know I had. You know what I mean? I had space in my life to be doing something. And that was a real light bulb moment. It was really important. It was really powerful. And it was like, do you want to go back to watching mediocre television, or do you want to do something with that time? And around the same time, I'd been bought Stephen King's On Writing, and I was reading that as well. And the two moments just collided, really. That realization that I had time and I could spend it doing something. And then reading On Writing and Stephen King saying, do you need permission to write? Very well, I give you permission to write. And those two things kind of collided. And I was like, I'm going to write. I'm going to go back to that. So having decided that, the first thing I had to sort of get my head around was writing something longer than a short story. Because the thing was, up to then, I mean, it's not an exaggeration, I'd never gone back to anything. I mean, once when I was 10, I wrote a story that was longer, but almost everything else, I'd never gone back. I'd never sustained. So it was like, okay, you've got to write something longer than a short story, something you have to keep coming back to. So that was the first kind of bit of motivation for Lifeline. Then the second thing that bubbled up was just like, I mean, I don't know. I think at the time I was becoming aware that extreme horror was this kind of subgenre that was kind of getting some interest. And I think part of me felt quite challenged by it, because I'm actually quite squeamish, believe it or not, and I kind of struggle with extreme horror. And then I thought, well, could you actually write something that is kind of quote unquote torture porn, which I know is kind of a derogatory term that's labeled on Splatterpunk by people who don't like it, but like, could you write something like that? And could you A, sustain it, and B, keep it interesting, and C, stomach it? So it was kind of like a triple challenge, really. And again, allied with that, it was just, and it's got to be long, it's got to not be a short story. So it was quite mechanical, really. And then I came up with the premise for Lifeline quite organically. It was just, I mean, it sounds ridiculous. It's true. I was cycling home from work on a autumnal night or a winter night, and it was dark. And at that point I was still working shifts, so it was really late. It was like 10:30 or something, or 11 o'clock at night, and I'm cycling through these deserted town streets through a housing estate, and there is a bridge and a hill that I go down on the bike. And I thought, it just came to me. It was just like, what if someone knocked you off your bike right now with a baseball bat? Which is really like, that's really childish, right? That's a really kind of, I think in retrospect, that's very similar to like the kid thing of like, what if there was a secret door in this room, or what if you found a treasure chest in a lake, or what if it was really like that. What if a guy stepped out with a bat? And that's literally all I had. And I just started writing with those parameters in mind. I just started writing, and the challenge was, you got to keep going, you got to keep it interesting, you got to keep it scary, and it's got to be good, it's got to be quality. So that's where Lifeline came from, certainly. And then the next two I wrote were The Loving Husband and, is that actually true? No. So there's a couple of short stories in between that got published elsewhere, but certainly very early on. I think The Loving Husband was the second piece I wrote, which again I tried to go long on, and that was about, my challenge for that was, could you write a first person narrative in such a way that the reader becomes aware of information that the character doesn't have, or that the reader realizes that the character is wrong about something they think they're right about? That's what I wanted to achieve with that. That's what I was setting out to do, and I failed miserably at that.
Well, I don't think so at all.
Well, what I think I got out of it was something powerfully ambiguous, and that works as a piece. I mean, I love that story. I'm really proud of it. I don't feel like I nailed exactly what I wanted to get, because the audience response to that story varies wildly. And it's really funny because everyone's really certain that they understand what that story's about, and yet everyone's got their own read on it. Now, I think that's brilliant. I love that about it. And I actually think that in some ways that's more interesting than what I was trying to achieve. But it does mean I didn't land what I was trying to do exactly, I don't think.
Yeah, I mean, maybe from some of you, I mean, personally, from my point of view, that story, The Loving Husband, that's my favorite because of that. Because you as a author, as a writer, are telling me a story, but you're telling me it indirectly, which I thought was fantastic. I thought you absolutely nailed that.
Oh, that's nice to hear. Thank you. I mean, the responses I liked. I remember someone reading it, and they were kind of, I think it might have been on Goodreads, and they were doing it. You can kind of respond in real time on Goodreads when you get a certain way through. You can add a comment. And someone was just like, why doesn't he just talk to her? You know, like all this kind of stuff, like getting really wound up by the narrator, you know, which I loved that response. You know, that was great. But the fun thing I've had is I've had everything from, well, he'll never do anything like that again, will he? It's a complete one-off, to like, he's clearly a serial killer and he's going to keep doing this over and over and over again. And, you know, he seems like a fundamentally nice bloke too. He's obviously a complete psychopath. And everywhere in between, like everywhere in between those spectrums of things, you know, people saying, like, I can really, you know, there's something almost noble about him, you know, to, my God, this man is a horror show and this poor woman has no idea what she's married to, you know. So I mean, that's fun. I like that it gets those responses, but at the same time, I know what I was aiming for. And look, I've tried this since. I still haven't pulled it off, but I'll keep trying. I didn't nail that. What I wanted was everyone to know the same thing, and that doesn't. I didn't achieve that, which is, you know, which is fine. I like what I did get.
It's like a crossword puzzle for the person to fill in, isn't it? They put their own clues in there.
Yeah, exactly. A crossword puzzle without enough clues. I guess that's exactly what it is. Yeah, but that's okay as long as the words match up and it feels satisfying. I guess it's okay. And then I think the debt was me working off, because I worked in a pub for about a year in between 98 and 99, and it was a really you know, the pub was interesting because it was in a rich area of London, but it abutted a real, like a council estate area, and there was a sports bar where most of the people went, but then there was a proper old school public bar that was frequented by almost entirely by people from the estate, and was very, very, very London working class male kind of. I mean, it wasn't. I mean, obviously, it wasn't same sex, because that would have been illegal. But it was, pragmatically, it was. Women didn't go in there. It was the old boozers, the old East End geezers, and most of the regulars were chronic alcoholics. I mean, you know, functioning alcoholics. They had jobs, but you know what I mean. Like, they were in there every night, drinking like 4, 6, 8 pints every single night of the week, and yeah, and I saw and heard some things in there that just were just astonishing to me, and I was too young really to know how to deal with it, you know. But it really bugged me. So I mean, the villain, funny enough, actually, the villain from Lifeline comes from there as well. That guy was real. I met that guy, and he, yeah, I very nearly got the shit kicked out of me by him outside the pub one night. So you know, he's a real person just transposed into a different environment. But the debt came from that bar and came from those people. But it was also about, like, at the time I wrote it, funnily enough, it was, and I'm thinking, what was it, 14, 15? So it was after the crash, but I was thinking back to the credit crunch, you know, and I was thinking back to that situation a lot of people got into with negative equity and with credit card debt, you know. And it felt to me like one of the things that I want to write about is real life horror. Like, I don't go supernatural very often. I can do it, and I don't, and sometimes it's appropriate, and sometimes I can get a lot of fun out of it. But I think my first love is kind of non-supernatural horror, which might be a fancy way of calling it crime fiction. I don't know, but I really like that. And for me, I wanted to write something about. I mean, I'm always writing about people being attacked and crushed by massively powerful forces outside of their control. But I really wanted this one to be about economics. You know what I mean? I wanted to write something about someone just being crushed by circumstances. And again, I mean, I think the debt's my favorite of the 4 in the collection. And I think that the reason for that is precisely that. I'm just really proud of the way it, I mean, it's not preachy and it's not big P political even, I don't think. Maybe small p, but not big P. You know, it is a story. It's a compelling narrative, and I think it's really gripping. But it's about something real. You know, it's about a real situation. And it is kind of that, what do you do when you've got no good choices, you know? And what do you do when your only way out of a mess is to get yourself into a different kind of mess, you know? And it's also about relationships as well, like Love and Husband. There's a component in there about, you know, I guess about toxic masculinity, really, about what men will do to sustain relationships, and just the level of dishonesty that men can sometimes sustain in order to keep an intimate relationship going. And like, yeah, that was so there's a lot going on with the debt, and I also like the end of the debt, because I think that's still probably my favorite ending of any of my stories. So yeah, that was that. And then Genesis was written much later, and Genesis really was about someone was doing an anthology, and the idea was that you wrote a tie-in to your novel. And most of the people in anthologies were doing zombie novels, because it was 2014 or 2015, and everyone was writing a zombie series. Do you remember that? Like, it was just I can't remember the name of the publisher now. They ended up folding, but there was this one publisher that were putting out like 60 books a year or something, and they were all zombie novel series, right?
Yeah, that was the peak of it, wasn't it? Because it was just at that point you start seeing submissions on websites saying no zombie stories.
No zombie stories, exactly, because it was just absolute saturation of this stuff. And yeah, and as I say, literally everybody was writing a series. Was it Permuted Press or something like that, who were just hoovering up all of them and just putting out like ridiculous numbers of these books. And yeah, and anyway, so a series of those authors were pulling together an anthology, and I knew one of the authors because she was also a reviewer, and she'd been very supportive of my work. And she said, do you want to include something? It was called From Hell's Gate, I think, and so I felt that, I mean, obviously it wasn't a zombie series, but I thought, well, I could write a tie-in for God Bomb, because one of the decisions I made when I wrote God Bomb was that I wasn't going to have a story. I wasn't ever going to take the bomber's point of view. And that was a kind of this is going to sound a bit odd maybe, but it was actually partly at least a moral decision, because I feel that we probably spend too much time in pop culture and in reporting obsessing about the motives of bad people, when we could probably be better spending more time on focusing on the struggle of the victims and what it's like for them and how we help them. I kind of, once you've crossed the line into deciding that other people's lives are essentially meaningless or can be used as chess pieces to achieve your ends, I kind of don't give a shit about you anymore. And I don't care whether you're doing it for Allah or for eugenics or racism or fucking Stalin. I don't give a shit. You've crossed the line, and you're kind of an asshole at that point. And I think that it's weird. I'm a total hypocrite on this, because I love Hannibal Lecter and I love Silence of the Lambs. I love all that shit, but I also kind of don't like it. I'm kind of annoyed by it, because I think it fetishizes villainy in a way, and it fetishizes people who in real life generally actually aren't that fucking interesting. So when I wrote God Bomb, because I was writing about one of these people, I was writing about a psychopath, I kind of wanted to focus on the victims. I kind of wanted to focus on the poor sods who just had the bad luck to be in the same room as this arsehole when he finally flipped. So I didn't put it in the novel, and I stand by that decision. I mean, it's interesting, some reviews said they wished they'd gotten a chapter from the point of view of the bomber, but I still think it was the right choice for me and for the book. I think the book's stronger for it, but I did wonder, because I did know, that's the thing. I did have a pretty good idea of what was motivating him. And I had to, because I still had to write what he did. And you can't write what someone's going to do unless you know why they're doing it. So I did have a fairly good idea of the contours, at least, of what was going on with him. And it did occur to me, well, if you write it outside of the novel, then it works as a standalone, and it doesn't impact on the integrity of what you wanted to do with the novel, but it does give people something extra to go into if they want to. So that's where that one came from. And the other thing was, at the time when I first wrote it, I was expecting the novel already to be out, but actually the novel release got delayed because I got picked up by this group called the Sinister Horror Company, who decided they wanted to publish it. So so we ended up delaying the release, which was brilliant, because it meant it got an actually decent cover. So that was great, and I'm really, really happy. But it meant that what was originally intended to be a prequel, i.e. something that had been released after the original, it actually became an on-ramp for the novel for people who read the collection first. And I'm actually really happy, because I think Genesis does work both ways. I really think if you read Genesis first, it wouldn't damage your experience of God Bomb, it would enhance it. But I also think, or hope at least, that for people who've read God Bomb as a kind of, I guess it's almost like a bonus track, right? They'll get something out of it too.
So Genesis was written. So had you completed God Bomb in its entirety and then went back to write Genesis?
Yeah, absolutely. God Bomb was with you guys. God Bomb was in the edits, and we were talking about cover art and figuring out release dates. when I wrote Genesis. Yeah.
What was it like to return back to the Godbound world? I mean, you probably thought you'd done with that, right?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's because it felt good because I got to scratch the itch, having made the kind of moral decision not to explore this guy. I then got to have my cake and eat it. Do you know what I mean? It gave me an opportunity to step outside of that novel, and because the other thing about the novel is, for me, the integrity. I know we're not here to talk about God, but like the integrity of that novel is in the fact that it's a ticking clock, like it's set in a time and a place, and it takes place over those hours, and we do not go outside that. You are in that room the whole time, and that's why it's written in present tense. Everything I'm doing in that novel is trying to pull you into that room. And you go outside the room very, very briefly at one point, but that's it. You're in that room for the duration. And again, to cover what this story covers, to cover what Genesis covers, would have had to have broken that. And I just wasn't prepared to do that, because that's not what I was trying to do. So yeah, it was a real pleasure. It was a real pleasure to go and tell Isaac's story, and get that down. And I quite like it too. I think that because I knew it was some big triggering event, but I didn't know what the big triggering event was, right? So I did discover most of it on the page, but it came together very, very quickly. The idea of his father being involved in some kind of fairly high level smuggling operation that involved, drugs and arms, not firearms, but the bomb vests and stuff. And there's a strong suggestion that it's linked perhaps to some kind of Irish terrorism splinter cell, because we know in real life, the IRA did trade guns and drugs with various other international terrorist organizations. So it's plausible, at least, and it kind of ties in with all of that. And they're coastal, and I know that. I grew up in North Devon. I know that coastal Devon and Cornwall is a haven for smuggling to this day. An awful lot of the drugs and contraband that come in the country come in through that coast, because it's big and it's not very well populated, so it's quite easy to find secluded areas to do that stuff. So it came together really quickly, and I think the thing I really love about Genesis is the pivotal scene where he's trapped behind the sofa, and he can hear what's going on. And that was great, because I knew what was happening on the other side of that sofa, and I just got to picture it all, and then I had to translate it all back into sound for Isaac, who's trapped behind the sofa. And that was, it's a shameful thing to say, really, because it's a horrific scene, but I had so much fun writing that.
Joys of being a horror author, isn't it? It's like getting kicks off sometimes when you get into that kind of real gruesome territory.
Yeah, but what I love about it is it's really gruesome, but at the same time it isn't. It's literally, I think what's fun about that is you the reader, are vicariously experiencing the horror through Isaac, and actually part of the horror is the sensory deprivation, and it's like that thing of King talks about this, right, in I think it's Dance Macabre. He talks about the problem with a horror movie, why it's never as scary as the book is. As soon as you can build up all the tension you like about the locked door that's being banged up against, right? You can, and in cinema you can build up a huge amount of tension, but eventually you got to open the fucking door, and as soon as people see the 50-foot monster, they go, oh, well, at least it wasn't a 100-foot monster, there's nothing you can see on the other side of that door that's going to be scarier than what's in your head. And what I like about that scene is I get to do for both Isaac and the reader, you get that experience of you're just getting clues, and the clues mean that your imagination is going absolutely wild, filling in the dots, painting the picture,
So you talked about sort of your inspirations, where they come from. A lot of it comes from real life, the things around you, the people that you see in the situations, as well as the kind of those weird little what if moments that just sort of pop into your head. So you're kind of drawing on all of them. So that's where you're getting your inspirations from. I was wondering where your influences come from. You've mentioned King a few times. I assume he was an influence, was he, on your writing of Breaking Point?
Oh yeah, King is a gigantic figure for me. He's a Mount Rushmore writer. He's, you know, he's just an all-time, you know, I mean, I've written about this and talked about this at length. I read it when I was 11, and it literally changed my life. It changed what I knew fiction could be, what was possible to do. It still kind of defines horror for me in an awful lot of ways. Just in terms of the lengths you can go to. It's funny, I was watching Doctor Sleep last night with the missus, and it's not like a superb movie, but I did enjoy it. And there's just a moment in that where, I mean, spoilers for Doctor Sleep, I guess, if you haven't seen it yet, but like a kid gets murdered. And it's that thing of like, you're watching it and it's like, you know, there still aren't a lot of people that are prepared to do this. You know, something as simple as that, you know, just a kid getting killed. And like, you know, King just fucking goes there. That's the thing that I love about him and his work. Like, it, at this point, it's an odd thing. I've got this strange kind of almost sort of schizophrenic relationship with King, because on the one hand, King is comfort reading for me at this point. I can pick up a King I've read a lot of times, and it's just a pleasure to read. But at the same time, he still finds a way to kick you in the nuts when you're reading, you know what I mean? Which I really admire, like, because it is not short of, I mean, everyone remembers the iconic Pennywise stuff and the clown and that, but like, I mean, the opening chapter of that book is a 6-year-old boy gets his arm ripped off by a monster in the sewer. It's fucking terrifying, you know? So yeah, King's a massive influence. I mean, again, I've been thinking about this a lot lately. I love pulp horror. I love pulp crime as well. I love hardcore noir crime thriller stuff. I really love like Jim Thompson and James Ellroy. My God, that guy's a fucking master. And you know, stuff like that. I love Ian Fleming, even though he's a horrendous, racist, misogynist piece of shit. He's also a brilliant writer of thrillers, I think. So I love reading the Bond novels. I reread them a lot, and they continue to be an influence on me. The thing about Fleming is it's the obsession that I love about Fleming. Fleming is completely obsessed with certain environments. You know, the ocean, the Caribbean Ocean, he's obsessed with. He's obsessed with gambling and casinos. He's obsessed with, you know, there's certain Jamaica he's absolutely obsessed with, and that obsession comes out in the writing, and you know, you picture it through his eyes, and it's really thrilling. Even when what he's seeing is kind of appalling, right? Even when his perceptions are warped and kind of gross, it's still really compelling because of the passion behind the writing. So that's a big influence for me. And who else? Like Kellerman. But I also really like literary horror. So I mean, you know, Adam Neville's just amazing. Ramsey Campbell, although he's a later influence. I didn't read Campbell as a kid, but I came to Campbell fairly recently, actually. But I mean, Demons by Daylight changed the way I thought about short horror fiction in particular. And actually, I went on, the first short horror story I wrote after reading Demons by Daylight was Fishhooks, which ended up in New Fears 2. And I mean, I credit that book with it, because there's been a step change in my writing since I read it, without question. But I like, and obviously I'm reading a lot of Brian Keane at the moment, and that's been an influence because I love he's got that pulp approach in terms of pacing, and in terms of character, which I think is really important, character and voice. I mean, that's something he's got in common with King as well. I think King's character work is sometimes underrated. His ability to sketch a character really quickly is really impressive. But I mean, shitloads. Yeah, I mean, so that's the writing. But then, yeah, the other thing is I read a lot of nonfiction and I watch a lot of documentaries. And I find at least as many of my story ideas, more of my story ideas come from that, come from a newspaper headline or a long read article or whatever. Many more of my ideas come from there than come from fiction. I go to fiction, I think, for the stylistic side of things, but I think for actual inspiration for ideas, I think it's the real world. That's where I get that stuff from.
It's all connected back to that kind of real world influence, and then that real world horror that you like to put on the page, really.
Well, I think what I've worked out is that the act of writing for me is an act of exploration. This is why I don't plot ahead of time normally when I'm writing fiction. I think writing's a form of therapy for me. It's a way of me trying to make sense of the stuff I can't make sense of. So if something really bothers me, or something really upsets me, or something really concerns me and I can't get my head around it, it's a fairly safe bet I'm going to end up writing about it sooner or later. Now, in the non-fiction, that means if a work of art really fucks me up, I'm going to write about it. I mean, that's what my life in horror is, effectively. That's me excavating my childhood traumas with art and going like, what is it? Why did this particular thing, you know, mess me up so badly? But obviously it's the same when I'm doing fiction. When I'm doing fiction, I'm talking about what real world thing have I come across recently that's just, you know, short fused my brain and given me like nightmares or whatever it might be. And that's what I'm going to be writing about, you know. Which is why it tends, I guess that's why the genre ends up being this kind of weird crime / non-supernatural horror area, you know, because that is mostly what those concerns are going to end up with.
And when you've got those concerns and you're writing about them, what is it you're doing? Are you exploring those ideas in order to make sense of them? Like, how are you working through it?
I think the thing is, sometimes sometimes people will say something will happen, some horrific news story will happen, or some crazy thing will happen, and someone will say, I just can't imagine how anyone could do that. Or I just can't imagine how anybody really thinks that or really says that. And I think for me, I always see that as a challenge, because I think for me, what I've realized is 9 times out of 10, if I put the effort in, I normally can imagine why. And I think that there's value to taking the effort to imagine why. I think that's actually a useful thing to do. And that's not about anything kind of hippy dippy about forgiving or greater understanding or we're all really one. I don't think, because I believe in evil, you know, I believe there is evil in the world, and I believe one of our jobs as human beings is to fight evil. I mean, that's something that me and King see eye to eye on. I'm not religious, but I believe in that for sure. And you know, I think that if you believe there's evil in the world, then you have a moral responsibility to figure out what you're going to do about that, you know. But I think that you tie one hand behind your back if you're not trying to understand. I think that I get really, really fucked off when people talk about evil as monstrous, or people as monsters. That drives me nuts, because I think that, and we're back to Hannibal Lecter, I guess, but dehumanization is always a mistake. As soon as you dehumanize someone, you are no longer addressing the reality of the situation. So when I say it's a mistake, I don't mean that as a moral judgment. I mean, you're making a category error, because people are not monsters. They are people. They will do monstrous things, but they are still people. And as soon as you call them a monster instead of a person, you are creating an artificial barrier to understanding. And if you don't understand, you're never, ever going to be able to predict, overcome, prevent, combat effectively. You can't do any of those things if you don't understand. So for me, and this is the roots of God Bomb in particular, I guess, although, you know, Genesis explores this a bit as well. Like, it's really important to understand the people who do the things that drive us crazy and that make us scared. And to do that, I think humanization is necessary. And again, I want to be clear about what I'm saying and what I'm not saying. To understand is not to excuse, right? And I'm not saying that we shouldn't stand in moral judgment on people who commit evil acts. We should, in my view, and we frankly sometimes don't do it enough. But in order to do it, we have to first understand it. And to understand it means reckoning with the humanity of the people who do monstrous, inhuman things. So I think that's a big part of what's going on, is that I am trying to, a lot of the time, I'm trying to understand. Now, sometimes it's not people, sometimes it's forces, right? So the debt isn't about individual people. The debt's about, I mean, capitalism, I guess, really. It's about the wider economic forces and how they can crush individuals. The finite is about the bomb, right? Which again is this power that's completely unimaginable, outside of the control of 99.99% of us, but at any given moment theoretically could just suddenly end the lives of millions, you know. And I guess lurking right in the background of all of that right now in the state of the world in 2020, there's climate change, which is starting to creep into my work here and there. Lots of imagery. I mean, the short piece I did for the sampler, the Sinister Horror Company sampler, swimming, that's climate change, right? That's me worrying about what kind of a world my kid's going to end up in. You know, when the you know, the sea levels rise high enough and it's just like there's no arable land left and there's no fucking bees left to pollinate anything, and you know, we're all, you know, it's just humanity ends up just being a coda. You know, we're just a semicolon, and then life goes on, but we don't, right? So I think I'm always wrestling with that, and that's the experience of writing for me. Is just I'm trying to figure out, I'm trying to imagine something. I'm trying to imagine something that I'm struggling with. I'm trying to make sense of it.
So on that subject of like themes and messages, then you've touched on a few already, but thinking about the stories in Breaking Point and the collection as a whole, what kind of themes and messages are you exploring, and are you trying to communicate with that collection?
So okay, so I think the two are very different things. I try and avoid messages, actually. I don't think messages are very helpful in fiction generally, and this is this is a point on which I sometimes, you know, I have shall I say, polite disagreements with some of my friends, especially, I mean, like, you know, we haven't talked about politics yet, but obviously I mean, it's fairly clear, I think, from everything I've said, I'm towards the left of the political spectrum, and I think that there is a real debate for those of us on the left in the political spectrum who are also creatives about the degree to which politics informs our work. And I think for me, I'm very uncomfortable with the idea of a message, for two reasons. One, my primary job actually is to entertain. I believe very strongly. If I fail to entertain, I fail utterly, and it doesn't matter what other good stuff may or may not be in my book. If you're not compelled to turn the pages because you want to know what's going to happen next, if you're not feeling excited and scared about the characters and wanting to see what happens to them, or hoping they'll make it out, or hoping they won't, I'm not doing my fucking job. And it doesn't matter what else I care about, I'm not doing my job. And actually also, like, I really believe that with the current fucking state of the world and where we are, that entertainment in itself is actually important. It's actually vital. It's actually, like, I wouldn't have got through lockdown without some of the books I've had to read and the TV I've had to watch. Like, and that's not an exaggeration. Like, this stuff is vital for your mental health. It's vital for your, you know, sense of self, and for a way of escaping from where you are right now. And all of that stuff is like important and valuable. And actually, that's my main job as a writer. That's, I think, in my opinion, anyone's main job as a fiction writer. So consequently, yeah, I'm not big on, not only am I not writing with a message in mind, I'm trying to avoid messages actually fairly actively. What I am committed to when I'm writing is telling the story as honestly as I can. In other words, I'm trying to imagine and see the characters as clearly as I possibly can, and then I'm asking the question, what would really happen? And I'm writing down what happens. That's what I'm doing. And I just have to trust that'll work, and that my imagination is strong enough and my words are good enough that people will be picked up by that.
And that sorry,
go on.
just
no, go on.
That just made me kind of think. So the way that you set up your writing is you ask yourself a question and then you go, well, how would this play out? And you kind of touched on it a little bit earlier with regards to how you write, and the fact that you kind of mentioned that you didn't plan. So I just wondered, with the stories in Breaking Point, was that the case, that you just have this question, you sit down and you just write, or did you have some idea of where it was going to end before you started? How did you actually write those stories?
Oh no, 100%. So Lifeline, I just flung myself at it. I mean, Lifeline was literally like, I had the guy with the bat and the bike ride. I had the first chapter, and that was it. And I think initially I had a vague sense that Frank wasn't going to make it. I think that when I started the story, I thought he was going to be tortured to death. And I think that, I mean, which, you know, that kind of, in a way, that kind of flags a certain level of naivety, because like, I think it would never have been published if I had done that, because like one of the rules of first person is like, you can't have the guy die at the end of a first person story, especially not first person present, because how is he telling you the story? But like, even that basic fact didn't occur to me at that time, you know, like, because I wasn't thinking at that level as a writer. It was pure instinct I was going on. So I think when I sat down with Lifeline, I had no plan beyond the baseball bat, the torture to death line, which I ended the reading with. That was it. That was what I had. And then I I was just going to play it out and literally just see what happened. And what happened with Lifeline was I got to a certain point in the story, and this is going to sound weird, but I'm just going to say it. Frank, who is the protagonist in the story, who is the point of view character, just started asserting himself. He refused to despair. He decided he wanted to live, and it started happening on the page. It started manifesting this will, this determination, this desire to not submit to his circumstances. And that was just about discovering the character as I wrote. And I remember getting to the point where I realized that was happening. And it was a very, very, very strange feeling. It is a very strange feeling when the characters start taking over. But it is what happened. And I remember very consciously thinking, all right, Frank, I'll give you a go. I'll give you a shot. Show me what you got, you know? And I just let it happen. I just let the story go. And that's when I think the idea of the mobile phone came in. And that's where I think kind of the story started to pivot for me and really, really started to come to life in the writing as well. My memories from that point on, I was flinging myself at it fairly consistently. The only other thing that I remember with Lifeline is there was one sticking point, I think. I'm trying to remember where it was. Oh yeah, I can remember. So there's a moment in the book where, in the story, where the Frank realizes he's got the phone in his pocket, and because it vibrates, I think because it's running out of battery or because she's getting the message through to him, I can't remember. He feels the signal, and his torturer sees him feel the signal but doesn't realize what it is. And I remember actually getting stuck at that moment in the writing of not being sure how that was going to resolve, how I could possibly get Frank through that moment without him giving himself away. And if I remember rightly, what I ended up doing was writing the indecision into the story. I actually have Frank freeze at the same moment that I froze. And I let the tension ratchet up. And then Frank kind of spontaneously comes out with a plausible, deniable story, just as it looks like he's going to give himself away. And that all happened on the page and was a direct response. But I think my memory is I stopped writing for a couple of days and I was really kicking it around and I couldn't see a way through. And eventually, weirdly, I just remember thinking, okay, well, just don't see a way through, write a way through, just sit down and do it and see what happens. And of course, as I say, once I made the decision to put the same indecision I was feeling into Frank's mind, that just got me past the block. And then it was pretty much plain sailing from there.
So you effectively channeled the character. You put yourself into the character into you at that same point, and then just went with it.
Yeah. And I think, look, I mean, that ties in with, I mean, again, I've talked about this before, but that ties in with the thing about first person and about the fact that my first kind of big creative experiences as a kid was acting. I did youth theatre for like 5 or 6 years now, and I did theatre at college for another 3. So although I've, got neither the inclination or the ability, frankly, to go back to that world or any desire to do that, I've still got that history there. And the thing about acting is that or the way I did acting anyway, is that you use the script to find the character. So the script, it was like a set of clues that you'd use to kind of say, okay, so if this is what they're saying out loud, what are they thinking, and you kind of reverse engineer from the script to work out who the person was, because certainly with the directors that I was working with, the script was sacred. You couldn't improvise, you couldn't fuck about. So you had to start with the script and say, okay, so if I'm going to say this stuff out loud, what's motivating me to say it? And that was, as I say, you kind of reverse engineer the character from there. And weirdly, with the writing, it kind of works the same way in reverse. So what I do is I create the character, I get a sense of who the person is in my head. And then it's just a question of transposing their response to whatever situation I throw them into. And that's certainly what was going on with Lifeline. And as I say, the one sticking point was where I thought, Christ, I don't know what Frank's going to do. And it wasn't until I said, okay, so Frank doesn't know what he's going to do either. Just put it on the page. And then it, as I say, that got me past it. So yeah, I think that's what's going on there. Certainly is, again, we're back to that thing. What would really happen? And the, King says in On Writing that plot is what happens when character meets circumstance. And as long as you see the characters clearly, and as long as the circumstances are interesting enough, you just have to let the cameras roll.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that not just me, I think there's a lot of people that have read your work. recognize the fact that you really do excel at that character and that voice. And I actually distinctly remember with Breaking Point being released, and you did a reading of The Debt.
Yeah.
And the way that you read that really brought that character to life. And then when I went back and reread it, the character just jumped out even more at me. I really got it from that sort of point. So that's interesting that you build the character in your head before you start writing. So can you talk me through that a bit more? Like, I mean, is that something that you just make up in your mind just before you're about to write, or do you think about it in advance, and do you make notes about these characters?
This is the infuriating bit, because there's no process. And I hate that, because I'm really into like demystifying the process for people. I'm really trying to not make it sound all kind of woo. Like, I hate that shit. I want, I think writing is something, it's not something everyone can do, but it's something many more people can do than realize. And I think that, I don't like the mystification, but I'm afraid with the characters, I don't really have a clue where they come from. They just kind of arrive, and it's fucking weird.
So do they arrive when you're writing, when you're actually at the keyboard and you're about to introduce that character, or have you thought about it before, when, I don't know, you've been out doing a day job, or you've been out doing some house chores before you sit down in front of that keyboard?
What I think happens, and all of this is speculation, what I think happens is I walk around with my eyes and ears very wide open. And one of the reasons that the non-fiction and the documentary stuff is so important is, as well as seeing, like, as well as being exposed to crazy stuff that's happening in the world, I'm being exposed to people whose lives are not like mine, right? Whatever that means. And in that sense, it doesn't matter what the documentary is about, as long as it's about something that's outside of my direct experience. It's incredibly valuable, because I'm seeing other people, other lives, right? I think what happens is that all of that stuff's going in my head somewhere. All of those people, all of those experiences, all of those motivations, all of those moments and ideas and, ways of seeing the world. I think all of that stuff is just being absorbed. It's just stuff I'm taking in. Once in a very, very long while, I'll consciously grab hold of a line or a gesture or a moment, and I'll think, I'm having that, like that's a really key, because how sometimes you'll get that where like a microcosm, explains a bigger thing. You'll see someone will say something and you'll think, man, that's not just that's that person's entire philosophy. That's the person's entire worldview in just their sentence, or you know what I mean? Like, you get a microcosmic sense that really, I'll try, and sometimes, and once in a very long while, I might consciously collect something like that. But I think almost all of this is going on under the hood. I think almost all of this stuff is subconscious, because the experience when I'm writing is just, I get to the point and then they just turn up. These people just turn up. They just arrive, and they're just there. They're just fully formed, and I just describe what I'm seeing.
And are they very much a character purposely for that story? You mentioned, are they sometimes almost wholesale a person that you've seen? So you mentioned in Lifeline that there was a character, the main torturer character was actually someone you modelled that actually on a particular person. Does that happen often, or is that just almost a one-off?
No, that happens quite a lot. Funnily enough, that happens more in the earlier work and less as I've gone on, and I'm not quite sure why that would be. I mean, I was going to say Frank's me. Frank's not me. I'm not that brave. I think in some ways, Frank's like an idealized version of me, a slightly more sarcastic, slightly more quick-witted, gutsier version of me. That's where I think, Frank, because I didn't want to have to craft someone a million miles away from me, because that would have just added an extra layer of complication. I wanted to get straight to the good stuff, which was like, you're facing an existential threat with no obvious way out. How does that make you feel? You know what I mean? So Frank's pretty close to an authorial insert. Although, as I said, with all the caveats I've just said, like, I don't think I'd be anywhere near as brave as Frank was. I'm not convinced I'd have the same level of kind of survival instinct that Frank did, but that aside. But yeah, the villain was that guy, and I think there are characters in God Bomb because I got the idea for God Bomb when I was 19, and when that book came out, I had some friends of mine from college who went to college with me, and they were like, "Oh my God, that's so and so." So there were real people who served as models for the characters in that novel, although again, they go to very different places in the novel than they did in real life. And I'm trying to think about the rest of Breaking Point. I mean, certainly there wasn't a kind of Godfather figure in that pub I was talking about that the Debt's modelled on, but there were a couple of characters who are kind of mushed, a couple of people who are kind of mushed together, and then just cranked it up a bit, if you know what I mean. But yeah, certainly some of the people in the Debt were modelled on the people I saw in that pub for sure. So yeah, sometimes they'll be direct. Sometimes it does work. Sometimes you'll just plug someone in, and I've got that. There's one I'm working on. Actually, I'm not working on it yet, but the next one I'm going to write, I've already done that, where it's the main character is based off a real life person. But other times they just kind of appear. I'm thinking about now. There's a moment I did a song for the Ends, my new novella. It's just come out. And there's a moment in that where I go to a football stadium, and this kid just appeared because I needed a football supporter. So I just found this 7-year-old kid, and he just was there. And he's only in it it's a cameo. It's a few hundred words, but he feels very real to me, that kid. And I have no idea, because I'm not a football fan. I haven't got my kid's female, not male. I haven't, I've got no direct correlation, but he feels like a real kid to me, and he just turned up when I needed him, really. And then had really shitty things happen to him because unfortunately he's in a Kit Power novel. So there you go.
Well, that's it. That's being a horror author, isn't it? You make and then do something like an horrible to him.
I tell you what, that is a thing. I do occasionally feel sorry for them. That is a weird thing. I do occasionally feel a bit sorry for the poor sods who wander into my stories. Like, I'm really glad they're not real, because I do feel really bad about some of the shit they have to go through.
Something that's very apparent in Lifeline is your love of music. So Wolf Mother is a band that gets mentioned in there.
Yeah.
And not a particularly well-known band either. So props for that one. But one of the things I like to ask with authors, I always find fascinating, is whether or not you listen to music when you're writing or editing. What conditions do you set up when you're in the creative process? And if you are listening to music, like when you were writing stories in Breaking Point, were you listening to music, and if so, what type?
Oh yeah, no. It's funny. I got out of the habit of doing it for a little while, of listening to music when I wrote, and I found it really impacted on my word count. I was really not getting as much done. No, I need it. I use music to block out the world and to zero in on the kind of emotional state I'm trying to hit when I'm writing. So Lifeline was written entirely to that Wolf Mother album. I had it on repeat the whole time that I was writing that novella. God Bomb was written entirely to Rage Against the Machine's Battle of Los Angeles and their debut album. So yeah, and a lot of stuff afterwards has been written to, there's a band called Sleep, who are a stoner metal band, and they did a song called Dope Smoker, which is an hour and 10 minutes long, single track of like super slow, sludgy stoner metal. And I've written a ton to that. It's been really good. I'll still crank that up every now and then. So yeah, I can't remember what tunes I was listening to for The Loving Husband or The Dare, but I will have been listening to music. I have to, and it generally tends to be rock or metal. It tends to be loud, but I'm trying to match the mood of the piece as well. So I mean, I don't know. The thing about Wolf Mother, I mean, the reason I picked that was because, I mean, that I love that album, but I saw Wolf Mother on the tour for that album at Hammersmith Apollo, I think it was, and I've seen a lot of live rock bands in my time. I mean, it's actually one of the writing projects that's going to be forthcoming. I think I'm going to do a series about the gigs I've been to, because I realised I kept all the ticket stubs. I've been to a lot of gigs, and I've had some good times. But that Wolf Mother show is definitely right up there amongst some of the loudest things I've ever been to. It was literally painfully loud. And I remember that feeling because I was up on the barrier by the left side of the stage by the speakers, and it was just, physically painful, punishingly loud. And I remember that kind of feel, and when you're at the barrier, you've got a bit of pressure behind you as well, so you're feeling kind of a bit squashed from both sides. And I love that space. I love the mosh pit. I love that feeling. But I remember thinking like, you'd only have to crank this experience up very, very slightly, and this would switch from being something amazing to being something really scary, And I think that probably subconsciously that's why I picked that particular band to be the soundtrack for Lifeline, because I think subconsciously I was probably linking back into that physical experience of being really constrained, not easy to move, squished, and then this sound just battering you, you know what I mean? And again, I want to be clear, I had a great gig. It's one of my favorite, it's a really, really fond gig memory, that gig. But I do remember thinking like, Jesus, this is really fucking painfully loud, And I write to music all the time. I think it's really important. As I say, I went through a period where I stopped doing it, and not really consciously, not out of a choice, I just did. And then after a few months, I was like, why am I struggling to write? Why am I finding it so hard to get a sentence out, or just put one word in front of another? And then I started listening to music, and I was like, oh right, yeah, because you need this shit, man. You need to tune the world out, and you need to get your brainwaves in shape.
In the bands you've mentioned, the music that you talked about listening to whilst writing, I notice majority of them all have lyrics in it. So you don't find the lyrics a distraction when you're writing?
No, because in all of those cases, the albums I know so well that the lyrics they don't engage me. They just wash over me with the rest of the sound, because I know them so well that they're just part of it. They're just part of the whole experience. And I think that, again, I think that they're working on me on a subliminal level. I mean, the thing about Rage Against the Machine is just that stuff is, I mean, I bought the debut Rage Against the Machine album the year it came out, and that's 1991, and I was 13 years old. So that album's been with me like it's been with me longer than it hasn't, right? It's been part of the soundtrack of my life, my whole life. And I've always connected with the anger on that record. It's always been like a real source of fuel for me, a real source of energy. So I don't hear that record anymore when I'm listening to it. I don't even, I can be singing along to it and I don't hear it. You know what I mean? I mean, wallpaper's the wrong word. It's much stronger than that. But you know what I mean? Like it's part of the fabric,
isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So no, I don't have that problem. All it does is, helpfully, is get my brain firing in that kind of emotional state and in that state of energy. And that's what I need. I need that kind of, because the other thing is that, again, what almost all my writing has in common, not quite all of it, but that sense of pace is really important to me. Most of my favorite reading experiences, my very, very favorite reading experiences, I can appreciate a range, but the stuff I love the most is that I cannot put this fucking thing down. I love those where it's just like you get to the end of the chapter and you're like, holy shit, what's going to happen? You know what I mean? Like that experience is like my favorite reading experience. And I always think you should write the stuff you want to read. You know what I mean? Like that should be what you do. So I'm always conscious that whatever else is going on in my stories, and I do, within that, I'm restless in exploring. There's loads of stuff I want to write, all kinds of genres I want to write in. I want to try almost everything at least once. You know what I mean? But within that, what I hope everything will have in common is that, I will command your attention for the length of time that I demand it, right? So it should never feel like a chore. It should always feel like a pleasure. It should always feel like a compulsion. I want readers to feel like they want to know what's going to happen next, like they're feeling, like someone is really pulling them along in a story. So, and the music, and all the music I listen to is part of that. It's got that vibe to it. It's got that kind of, and it I've always found that music inspirational, even when it hasn't inspired me to do anything except feel what I want to feel. And I think that it continues to inspire me just by lending me that energy, just giving me that vibe of like, because I mean, like if you strip it all away psychologically, the reason that music was so important to me at that age was because I was a freak. You know, I was this isolated, weird little kid in North Devon, surrounded by people who did not understand me and who I couldn't relate to in any way. And I felt completely alienated from my surroundings. I felt completely alienated from my peer group. And then there's this music, and this music is telling me it's okay. It's okay to feel how you feel. It's okay to, you know, to be angry about the state of the world, and you're not alone. You know, you may be isolated right now, but there are other people out in the world who get it and who feel as angry as you do about stuff, and who, you know, and I think that's, you know, connecting back to their energy is like, you know, that's like, I mean, it's like lifeblood for me, you know, creatively, and that's why it works for me with the writing. And that's why it doesn't distract me. It helps me focus, because it's like, it gives me that same sense of like urgency, that same sense of kind of relentless pace, that I'm always striving for when I'm getting the words down.
One thing that writers sometimes will do in a book is they will reference characters or places with particular names or particular areas. And it's something that necessarily as a reader I might read and not pick up, but some things are very deliberately put in there by the writer. So I just wondered, within Breaking Point, was there any places or character names or any kind of nods that you'd deliberately put in there that sometimes gets overlooked?
Okay, so in Breaking Point, kind of no. I think that, interestingly, I mean, I know that Lifeline and The Loving Husband, I know they're both set in Milton Keynes, but I very deliberately don't set them in Milton Keynes in the book. And the reason for that is in both cases it doesn't matter. And because it doesn't matter, in my view, it's better to leave it open, because then what will happen is the reader will place them where they want to place them, you know? I think sometimes as a writer, your job is to actually get out of the way of your reader's imagination. And it's almost like your job is to facilitate them unlocking their own imagination and figuring out for themselves what the situation is or what it looks like and things like that. Like, I mean, this is getting a little bit philosophical here. I mean, one of the reasons I'm very, very, very minimalist on description, occasionally slightly too minimalist on description, is that I think my job as a writer is to get the fuck out of the way and let the readers project their descriptions into the stories, to picture the scene how they want to picture it. You know, I think my job is to give them the bare minimum, to let them build the characters in their own head. I mean, it's funny, the reading I did from Lifeline, that's probably the most physical description I've ever given of a character in any of my books. And I think it works in that moment, because I think that in that moment Frank would be absorbing every detail of that guy and would be thinking about it, and therefore it's kind of okay. But even there, the description I give there is mainly, I think, will mainly trigger a picture in my readers' minds. And I'm sure that different readers will actually draw quite different portraits of that guy from that description. And that's not just okay, that's preferred for me, that's ideal for me. So there aren't really, so building on that, in terms of, you know, physical places, no. As I say, I happen to know that The Loving Husband is set in Milton Keynes, but I deliberately left that blank, partly because it didn't matter, but also partly because I felt that the writer of that story, the narrator of that story, would not want to put in clues as to where they were. And actually the fact that there are no named characters in that story is quite significant. I think in the back of my mind I had the idea that The Loving Husband was actually written by the narrator, and that it's something he's written purely for his own peace of mind, and he's stashed away on his hard drive somewhere, and it's never intended to see the light of day, you know. It's a confession, really. But given that, and given the nature of his character, he would be very careful not to talk about geography, you know, not to talk about setting. And I think with The Debt, it just is, it is London. I mean, it's obviously London, and it kind of doesn't, again, beyond that, it doesn't matter. It's working class London. So, you know, paint your own picture, please, because frankly, you'll do a better job than I could anyway. And it helps, I think. And again, this is opinion, and there are differences of opinion on this, but I think it gives the reader a sense of ownership if they can create their own version of whatever it is that you're telling them. And then I guess with Genesis, though, that's the one exception, because that is North Devon. And I mean, God Bomb's set in Barnstable. I mean, that's the town I grew up in. Well, not where I grew up in. That's where I went to college. It's where I experienced my later teenage years, those really formative years, and where I first had the idea for the novel. So Genesis had to be set there, really, because that's where and it is. Barnstable's a short drive down the motorway to the coast. So the journey that is taken by Isaac in Genesis on his motorbike it's not one I've taken, but it's ones that friends of mine that grew up there took. I mean, that was, again, that's the thing, isn't it? You don't even think about it, but I'm thinking about it now. I've got a friend who grew up in Barnstable, and he would describe for me him and his mate piling down that road at 2 a.m. on their crappy little 50cc motorbike, and one of them would be driving and the other one would be like behind him, skinning up, while they were driving down the motorway at like 70 miles an hour because it was empty. And I think that I clearly nicked some of that experience, some of that described experience when I was writing that section, because it came very easily. So yeah, I mean, that I can't remember. I do name Barnstable, don't I, in the novel eventually? I think because I talk about it being the police control room. So I finally give the game away late on in God Bomb. But yeah, Genesis is set there as well. But no, and in terms of people, no, there aren't. I mean, if there is in some of the new stuff I'm writing, I'm starting to tie them together in interesting ways. It's already kind of come out really from some early reviews, but there are connections between the two novellas, The Finite and the Song for the End. But I'm not talking about what they are, because I'm letting people find them for themselves, because I think that's more kind of interesting.
You've already mentioned earlier in the interview, your stories in Breaking Point were some of the ones where there are some of your earlier stories.
Yeah.
And some of the stories where you didn't just go down and write it in one hit and then never look at it again. So when you created these, did you use beta readers? Did you have people to read over them and give you feedback?
Oh yeah, I used because it was On Writing that got me going, I took On Writing very, very seriously. And On Writing describes a process. And the process is you write your D1, you stick it in a drawer for 2 or 3 months if you can. And then you go back to it and you try and, ideally, when you pick it back up again, it should feel like it's not yours. And then you red pen the shit out of it. And that's D2. And then when you've done that, then you send it out to beta readers. And then you get it back and you do a D3. And I followed that process to the letter. So I wrote Lifeline and then I stuck it in a drawer. And I wrote the Bar at the Edge of the Desert, which is the final short story in A Warning About Your Future Enslavement, and probably still my favorite of my short stories that no one ever published. It got like 40 rejections and I ended up sticking it at the end of my collection because I still love it. I still think The Bar at the Edge of the Desert is one of the best things I've ever written. So I wrote that and then I stuck it in a drawer, and then I wrote A Loving Husband and I stuck that in a drawer, and I wrote The Debt and I stuck that in a drawer. And I think it wasn't until after I'd written The Debt that I went back to Lifeline for the D2. So I was building up a bank of stories, and there may have been a couple of others. A Baptism maybe slips in around that period. That was another very early one, short story. So I wrote a ton of drafts. I wrote 3 or 4 or 4 or 5, and then I went back to Lifeline and did the red pen. And the way I did it was old school. I printed it out, single sheet, and I did get a red pen. I printed it out double spaced, manuscript format, and red penned it. And then I would send it out. So I think I had 4 beta readers for that one, 4, maybe even 5. I sent it out to a few people. My dad's a stalwart. I think he's read almost everything I've done. Dad's the only person who's ever read a D1, because there's been a couple of times I've got 6,000 or 7,000 words into something and gone, Jesus, I don't even know if this is any good, and I don't want to keep going if it isn't. So he's seen D1s, but he's the only person. No one ever sees a D1. But yeah, so I went through that whole process, the critical readers, and I got some great stuff. The one I really remember, I mean, there was a lot, and a lot of it was on the line edit level, so it's not immediately visible, but it all helped. But the big one I can remember from a story level, I sent it to a friend of mine who at one point in his life had been a bouncer and had therefore been in a few pretty serious physical confrontations in his life. And he said, my one real kind of top level comment, he said, is that when you're really taking a beating, he said, you get to a point where you just want the pain to stop and you don't actually care if it stops because they stop beating, or if it stops because you're dead. You just want it to stop. And that just went straight in. That just went straight into the book. And I can't remember where, but I remember writing that in as a line where Frank just gets to that point, that rock bottom point of like, I just want this to stop. I don't care how it stops now. And that's fucking gold, stuff like that. You know what I mean? That's just like, because that's a good example of where, when I wrote Lifeline, funny enough, I have broken my arm since, but I've never broken a limb when I wrote Lifeline. I'd never experienced, and part of what I was writing about, I think in retrospect, was like, I've never really experienced much physical pain for very long. I'm literally like at the level of like stubbed toes and scabby knees and shit. Coming off my bike when I was a kid and scabbing my knee up and shit like that. But you know what I mean? Nothing serious, nothing life altering or life threatening or anything anywhere near it, really. So I think some of it was like about, do I have the imagination to reach that far? Can I imagine this stuff based on my own very limited experience? And I think false modesty aside, I think I did pretty well at that. But that's the kind of insight you can't get unless you've been through it. That feeling of like, no, there's this rock bottom feeling. And funnily enough, once he said that, it did trigger a memory of myself of a childhood illness I had when I had like really bad, I got a really bad, I don't even know what it was to this day, whether it was food poisoning or like stomach flu or something. But I was on my 3rd day of not being able to hold down water. Right, of like vomiting and diarrhea every time I even drank water. And it's funny, I'd forgotten about it, and then when he said it, it triggered the memory of me going like, I distinctly remember hugging the toilet bowl, shivering, and just being like, I just want this to stop, and I don't care how. And it was that same feeling. It was like, I actually don't care if I die, I just want it to stop. So but it's stuff like that where like, that's where a beta reader is just worth their weight in gold, because they'll find those moments for you that jump out and it adds to the experience. So yeah, and then the same process for The Loving Husband, same process for The Debt, same process for Genesis. There'll have been different beta readers for different things. I've also got to, I know I do this in the acknowledgements on the book, but I got to shout out my wife in particular for The Debt, because the step I took with The Debt, she's a Londoner, and the step I took with The Debt was I actually sat with her and we read it out loud together. And every single time we hit a phrase, it was great because she read it in her accent. And every time she hit a phrase that wasn't right, we'd both just look at each other and be like, ooh, like it was instantly apparent when you heard it in a London accent when I'd fucked up the language, I'd screwed up the dialect. So that was really incredibly valuable. And, you talked about the reading I did. That's the reason that works as a reading is because it was done as a reading, and none of the changes were major, none of the changes were on a plot level, but that polish, I think, spectacularly transformed that piece,
So you talked about using Stephen King's On Writing as your guide, and you followed that to the letter. Now, you'll probably know this better than me, but there's something in there where he says the second draft equals the first draft minus 10%.
Yeah.
Something like that. So with that in mind, I wonder, did you follow that through? And was there any things that you took out of any of the stories in Breaking Point, you chopped out whilst you were doing the editing, or ideas you had before you started to write that didn't make it into the writing? You'd already mentioned the fact that in Lifeline, Frank wasn't going to survive to start with. I wonder if there's any other differences in any of the stories.
That's a good question. The short answer is yes. I did take the minus 10% rule very seriously as well. Still do. It's a really good mentality to get into. Bear in mind what I was talking about earlier with pacing. Interestingly, nowadays I don't tend to overwrite as much, and I'm actually finding it harder and harder to cut the 10% because I tend to be writing more to measure in the first place. But I think that's just a product of discipline. I think that's just a product of doing it. In fact, now I have the reverse problem. I actually get feedback from beta readers frequently now that says, I didn't quite understand this because I haven't put in enough detail. So nowadays it doesn't tend to be as much minus 10%. It tends to be more like plus 5%. But yes, for these ones, absolutely, because I didn't know what the hell I was doing, so I was just flinging words at the page. I don't think there was anything big. I know that Lifeline, for certain, there were at least a few times where I'd write a sentence and I'd describe something, and I'd literally describe it two different ways. And I just describe it one way, stick in a comma, and describe it a second way, sometimes a third way as well. And then on D2, I just pick which one I thought was the best and get rid of the other two, you know. So there's stuff like that for sure, where it changed. But I mean, no, I think really, I mean, one of the things I was really happy about with them is just the energy of them was pretty good for all three. Like, it's got the pacing thing that I wanted. So most of the edits were about just tightening it up even more. Just, I mean, it's that classic, you know, the classic one from I can't remember who it is. It's Strum, I think, which just says omit needless words. It's the simplest, harshest, but most useful bit of writing advice there is, I think. Just, you know, if you don't need the word, if you don't need the sentence, if it doesn't add anything, just cut the damn thing, you know, because different writers have different approaches, right? But again, for me, if the you know, the fundamental impulse is, I want this thing to you know, I want the readers to feel like they're strapped into a car that's going at 80 miles an hour with no brakes down a hill. If that's the vibe I'm going for, then the writing has to reflect that. You know, every sentence has to earn its keep. It has to be, you know, propelling the reader forward. And if it's not doing that, you cut the damn thing, you know, just get rid of it. So I think that, yeah, I definitely took the 10% thing on board. That was definitely a key component it will have been with all of these in this collection for sure, because at this point I was still overwriting at D1, not inappropriately, but with an eye to knowing I was going to be cutting in D2.
With the book out, and it's out in the world for people to read it as a collection with them all together thematically linked, that suddenly there's all these people that you don't know that can have the book, they can sit there, they can write reviews of it. So how did you feel just before that was about to be released?
I mean, it's a bit of a Breaking Point in particular is a bit of a strange one, because of course all of the stories had already been released, and I'd kind of been through the first round nerves with them already. I mean, Lifeline, I got some beautiful feedback for when it came out. You know, Duncan Ralston, John Bowden, Bracken McLeod, for Christ's sakes. I mean, these are really, really serious authors who had some very, very nice things to say about Lifeline. So I think it was unusual for me with Breaking Point in that I didn't have the normal set of nerves that I have had with other releases. I felt okay about it. I felt like I was more nervous about how it was going to be perceived. I think that I was more nervous about because they're the early stories. I think part of what I was worried about is people would be like, oh, well, he must have got better, so maybe not. And that, I think I'm still slightly worried about that, because I'm really fucking proud of this book. You know, like, I think they're really, really good stories. And there are, you know, I've done different things since, and I'm proud of a lot of what I've done since, but I'm proud of this book, you know. Yes, they are some of the first things I wrote when I started taking it seriously, but I'd been dicking about for 30 years, and dicking about is learning, you know. And I wouldn't have even dreamed of putting them out into the world if I didn't think they were of a reasonable standard, you know what I mean? And I think I was more worried about that with Breaking Point, which is the opposite of what I'm normally doing. What I'm normally doing is thinking, oh shit, what if nobody likes it? What if everybody hates it? What if it's awful? What if I finally fallen flat on my face and everyone's going to think, oh shit, yeah, he never really had it, did he? That's normally what I'm worried about. But weirdly, with Breaking Point, even though there were early stories, I didn't have any of that, because they'd already kind of gotten, you know, I'd gotten enough of a response from people who I really respected that I knew that these things, you know, held their own. It was actually more the reverse. It was more like, I'm more worried that it's not going to get picked up. I'm more worried that people aren't going to respond to it at all.
And when it was out as a collection, what response did it then get, and how did you take that?
Yeah, I mean, it was great. It was really positive. And I think for me, the thing I enjoyed the most was, as I said, really, it was the response to the multiple responses to Loving Husband has been so gratifying. And again, I think what I love about it is everyone I've spoken to about it has been so certain about their read. That is delightful to me. That a story that is so clearly so ambiguous, that everyone has their own theory, but is also convinced that their theory is what I was intending. I think that is just that is gold. That is absolutely golden to me. So that was great. And I think, yeah, I love, I love that people are still finding it and picking up. I mean, Kaylee, who's a writer who I've got a huge amount of respect for. I think she's really superb in her own right, and Corpsing, which I don't know if you've spoken to her yet about that for this series, but I'll be tuning into that episode because I think that's just a cracking collection. She's got a great kind of energy and approach, and I love her humor. And she did a review of Breaking Point recently where she'd gone back to it and reread it, and just, yeah, it was really, that was wonderful. That really gave me a lift to read that and see, again, a writer that I really have so much time and respect for, going back to my work and finding things in it. And I love the comparisons to King, because he's like a North Star for me. So anytime someone says it reminds, anything about my work reminds them of King, whether it's the pacing or the characterization, that's a gigantic compliment. Of course I'm going to feel good about that. And there hasn't really been any negative feedback, I don't think, on that collection so far. God Bomb got a couple of negative reviews, which is fine, because it should do. It's a divisive novel. It's an explosive novel. It deals with some tough stuff, and I think it would be very weird if everyone did like that one. But I don't know. It didn't really bother me. It's been the feedback's been really positive, and I've enjoyed it. Look, we write for an audience. We write to be read. I want people to find this stuff. I want people to enjoy it. So it's gratifying when I find out they have.
I was wondering, is there anything else that you'd like to talk about with regards to Breaking Point that we haven't covered?
That's no. The only thing I guess is we've kind of touched on it, but the thing for me that was interesting was the kind of the fact that the stories do feel so thematically resonant, because they were written as individual pieces at the time, and they were very much, in a lot of ways, that certainly the first three were very much at least partly writing exercises for me. Like, as I said, Lifeline was, can I write compelling splatterpunk? Can I write compelling torture porn? The Loving Husband was can I do this ambiguity? The Debt was like, the challenge was as much the voice as anything. Like, can I really get into this frame of mind? And also with The Debt, can I stick the landing? That was really a big thing for me, because The Debt is unusually for me, I knew where The Debt was going. In fact, The Debt started with the final image of the story. I think it was, no, it wasn't a dream, it was a kind of daydream, but I remember that final image coming to me and then just having to reverse engineer the entire story from there. But it was interesting looking at the three, reading the volume together, when you guys finally put it together and I was reading the proofs through, it really does work as a collection, and that's really gratifying. The fact that, because it's all about people pushed to extremes. It's all about what do you do when you've got no good choices, or you feel like you've got no good choices, when circumstances have conspired against you in a certain way, and you are where you are, and there's no way out that isn't going to be bloody and painful. And what do you do? What do people do in those situations? What's their psychological experience? What's their emotional experience? And that's still at the root of a lot of what I write about. That really hasn't changed. That, for whatever reason, that's one of the things I'm obsessed by to this day as a writer. For all the reasons we've talked about for the last last hour and a half. And I like how well that's there from the very beginning, from me starting out. Those are my obsessions, and it works. It works in the collection. They feel, although they are four very different stories starring four very, very different characters, they have that commonality of theme. And it's not samey, but nor does it feel like just four random stories. And that pleases me a lot. That really does, because that makes me feel like, one of the things I worry about is whether or not I've got a sufficient voice as a writer, because I'm always conscious that I'm trying very hard for the voice to be subservient to the character, and I sometimes worry about whether or not that means I'm sacrificing too much of of developing a voice that's consistent for readers, and there's always a tension there. But reading this one's really nice because it is 4 distinct voices, and yet they do have those thematic resonances, and it's made me feel more confident about my voice as a whole, and that my approach is okay. Because I think what I've come to is realizing, like, no matter how hard I fling myself at the character voice and in getting that as authentic as possible, I can trust that because it's me writing it, enough of me will bleed into it that it will still feel like it's a Kit Power story. Breaking Point's a good one for me. It's an affirmation. It really is. I'm really proud of it because it really is. It was, reading it back and going like, yeah, you can do this shit. You really can. It's okay. You've got this. And that's, I'm really happy with that.
Well, Kit, thank you ever so much for taking the time to answer my questions and take a trip down memory lane all the way back to creating Breaking Point. Thank you very much.
No, thank you, and thanks to Sinister Horror for getting it out in the world, man. It's a great thing to have out there and to hold in my hand. It's still pride of place on the shelf. So yeah, thank you, and thanks for inviting me on.
Breaking Point by Kit Power is available on paperback and Kindle. The Kindle can be purchased from Amazon. The paperback can be found through most book retailers, including Waterstones, Barnes & Noble, Amazon, and directly via the Sinister Horror Company at the website sinisterhorrorcompany.com. Thank you for listening. Being an independent publisher, we are just like you. We share the same passion, the same love for horror fiction. We believe in the incredible work being created, unnoticed by the mainstream. And we want to share it with the world. We are the Sinister Horror Company.